So I'm an extension plant pathologist, nematologist from the University of Arkansas. So a lot of my time is spent on nematology, as well as some of the target spot diseases. And you can see by your itinerary that you'll hear me again talking about southern rust. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in here. There's a couple of things you as consultants or looking at chemical sales or anything need to be looking at or thinking about when you go into a field and you're considering the importance of target spot. First, what is the cause of the spots you're seeing? I can tell you they're not all caused by the pathogen we're thinking about. When did the disease symptoms start? How early was that in the growing season? Based on the weather forecast, how fast is it going to develop? That is going to always have the major impact on any foliar disease. This particular disease likes it very hot. If southern rust is roaring in your area, target spot is a potential threat. Are the leaves that are affected important to yield? That's probably the major one, and that's probably the most difficult one because we like to have our fields clean. And then when should I apply a fungicide and which one should I spray? So hopefully address some of these by the end of this presentation. Okay, so this is the pathogen, Corynespora cassiicola, and those are the spores there on the left. It's got quite a broad host range. This thing's been around for a long time. It just seemed like recently, in the past couple of years, it went from being this minor issue that we didn't see much in soybeans, did never see in cotton, to something we're seeing quite frequently. Those are the dates that we've seen them in Arkansas, 2013 for that on cotton and 2015 for soybeans. So that's when our growers said, look, Travis, we need some help. We've got a problem here. And we went around searching and trying to identify what we can do to be helpful. All right, so what else can cause those similar symptoms, especially when we're talking about the lowered canopy? The calls I got mostly this year were that of herbicide injury. I'd like to say most of the time it's Liberty injury on Roundup Ready beans, but it could be other herbicides too. I'm not exactly sure what, but I can tell you this, when I get those soybean leaves into the lab, there are absolutely no spores on them whatsoever. And it's relatively uniform in the field. And I know from consultants you're looking at it and say, man, I'm seeing it, onset of disease, I better do something. No, wait. Until that canopy's closed, this thing is probably not going to take off and be a really significant issue. So keep that in mind. On the other side, in cotton, if you find this is kind of like finding some of the marbles in the field, the rarity with the ascochyta leaf spot. You can usually see it on the cotyledons, and then it really just doesn't do much after that. Usually has to be cold for that disease to show up, but it's another one that you could confuse it with. Later in the season, this thing tends to move up for both plant types. For soybeans, those spots become smaller. You don't see as large of a concentric ring, and you do not have that yellow halo all the time. And the yellow halo that you see there, that is often variety specific. Sometimes you'll see it, and sometimes you won't. So keep that in mind. With the cotton, it really starts looking, you have that purple margin, and those spots tend to be smaller and smaller. The reason it's smaller is as you move up in the canopy, what's happening? Relative humidity is starting to decrease. The amount of free moisture is starting to decrease, so the size of those spots are starting to decrease. At some point, either you're going to lose most of the leaves and there's so much airflow that the disease will not progress anymore. Okay. The other symptoms there, more of a rarity on soybean. You can find it on the pods, but you have to look for quite a few to find it. Usually when I see something like that, there's a lot of other things out there, anthracnose, that's also causing some of that similar problem. And then on the cotton as well, on the bracts, that we can see it. A few years ago, I think in 2 years ago, we had a lot in Arkansas, not so much last year, but the year before, and there was a lot of those red or maroon spots on the pods, the bolls, excuse me. And I tried plating those out. I never found the pathogen. The folks in Georgia said, yes, it was. I'm indifferent about that. I really don't think those are having a major impact. I think it's more the leaf loss. What else could it be confused with? You've all seen a lot of frog eye. We've got a lot of good varieties out there that have resistance to frog eye leaf spot. But as it's moving in the upper canopy, it's probably the only thing you could confuse it with. And then on the cotton, the Stymphalium alternaria complex, which we know is more of a nutritional issue than any fungicide will control it. So that's a potassium issue. So the thing that scares all of us is that defoliation, right? On soybeans, we get last year, not so much defoliation. The year before, we had quite a few, and a lot of those are variety specific. Now, some of the agronomists have done some great studies, and that they can remove 50% of the leaves from the bottom of the canopy up, and that contributes to a 10% yield loss. So it tells me that soybeans can handle quite a bit of leaf loss. Cotton, I think, is, you're starting to look at how valuable are those leaves at the bottom. If I had more airflow, could I have less boll rotting too? So a little disease is not that bad. It's really hard sometimes to stomach that, but I don't think it's such a bad thing. It's just when it starts getting past mid-canopy that we ought to start taking a look at this and saying, what are we going to be able to do about it? All right, so some of the things we do know. We do know that the fungus is a trash fungus, as I call it, so it's going to survive in the cotton and soybean debris. It's going to develop after the canopy closes. So once you have airflow through there, and I know it's always contradictory to whatever the weed scientists tell you and the entomologists. They're telling you get it closed as fast as possible, and we're telling you to keep it separated as long as possible. I know that contradicts each other, but that's when you're going to see it starting to develop. And you're going to have free moisture, water on those leaves for that disease to develop. We often see it in the fields that are intensively managed or those high yield fields. There's a lot of inputs going on there, a lot of fertility inputs, drilled beans, beans that are flooded. They're often never let to really dry out. It retains all that moisture. But the thing you really need for both of these diseases is some type of rainfall precipitation. The flooding itself is not going to drive it, but you do need some kind of free moisture. For us, you're looking at those 7 to 10 days of cloudy, wet weather that this is going to be a problem. But also at that time, it needs to be hot. When you walk out in the morning to go scout fields at 6 o'clock in the morning, it should be in the mid-70s. That's when this disease is going to be mostly problematic. If we get a high wind, dries things out, that's going to stop that event. Then we have to start over again, and we need those kind of conditions again. So anything that breaks it up really helps us. The last thing we do know is its variability from your field to your field, from Arkansas to Mississippi, when this starts, how fast it develops, which makes it a real challenge. So you might have seen this slide before. This is actually from Austin Hagen, kind of trying to give you a general idea of the risk zones. Those in southern Mississippi are probably going to be a higher risk, more humidity from the Gulf, more of that consistent wet weather. Arkansas, northern Mississippi being a little bit lower or a moderate issue. Again, some years we have it, some years we don't. For us last year, it really wasn't that big of a factor. The year before, it was a major issue. So definitely year specific. One thing that's driving that condition is definitely the cultivar susceptibility. These are just some of the observations we've seen and some of the work coming out of Georgia where they've looked at some of these different varieties, some of the phytogen here. Again, nothing wrong with these, but just some of the things that you might, if I was out scouting, I'm going to go look into the phytogen 499 or phytogen 490 if I'm going to go looking for target spot. And that's what I would go do first. Even this year, we had a field with Stoneville 4946, which people saw last year as being a problem, but this past year, it looked pretty good compared to phytogen 490. But that's another way you may look at this. Some of the folks in the southeast said that there's some tolerance, even though you can lose some leaf loss. There doesn't seem to be a real yield drag. And some of those Delta Pine 1252 and the Delta Pine 1588, tend to be a little more tolerant, a little bit more resistant, not as highly susceptible as some of those other varieties that are up there. So if we're talking about management when we get to fungicides, I would definitely be considering that using it on these that are susceptible before I'd use it on some of the others. That's when you're going to see your greatest response. Soybeans, there's just kind of a list there. The ones on your left were last year, and the ones on the right are from this last cropping season in 2017. Had a lot of calls about the credens 4748. Quite a bit of defoliation there. In our area, the Armor 47R13 and 17 had a lot of defoliation in 2016, and I think because of that, Armor killed that particular variety. And so in that 2016 season, a lot of those were not available, so that could be a contributing factor why we didn't have as much of a scare with target spot in 2017. There's definitely some others. This is not an exclusive group, but that does give you an idea of some of those that have caught our attention as well. The fungicide, take a look at a multi-year regional trial here. You can see the scientists that are involved there. I give them full credit for all of this, but this was kind of a group effort, which I think gives you some of the challenges we're having to deal with this target spot. So their objective was to evaluate the effectiveness of a single and 2 fungicide applications of those products that are registered for use to managing target spot. And this is really probably a 45-minute presentation, and I'm going to reduce it down just to a couple of slides I think that you'll find being more important. So in this first slide said it's extremely busy, but I'd like for you to take away from it is just the variation from that first fungicide application and the disease onset. So the disease onset is in bold. Look at all the variation in the timings that it happened. All right. So 3 weeks after bloom, the first week of bloom, the 4th week of bloom for disease onset. Historically, what the folks out of Georgia have said, if they find it in the first week of bloom, that's when they get the greatest response to a fungicide. But here it was definitely all over the board. And their first fungicide application, some of them went out before that observational time. And I think there's just only one of them, the one in Jay, Florida, went out after they identified the disease. So you can keep your eye on Florida if you're kind of being responsive to seeing that disease in the field. All right. These are the fungicide effects by location, and this is looking at defoliation specifically. And so there was significant differences between locations, so we're looking at all of those. Those with the stars on them, there was a significant response by the fungicides compared to the non-treated control. So what is that? 5 out of the 8 locations had a significant response. Preaxor in this case probably did the best in controlling the defoliation. All of those were significant compared to non-treated control, except for that in, I think, one of the Louisiana trials there. It didn't seem to have as great a response. So a little variation again there within some of that data set. Sometimes those are a little challenging to look at, so we'll look at a couple of the main effects here. 2 fungicide applications resulted in less defoliation in 1. What did it look like? 5% difference there. To me, sometimes that's not quite enough to justify that second application. So I've stopped the defoliation, but really what did I do as far as the yield response go? We already talked about Phytogen 499. It definitely had more defoliation than the Delta Pine 1137 in this study. Quite a significant amount, 41 to 24%. So that's getting quite a significant degree of defoliation between those two. And that was 7 out of 8 locations. So again, variety selection is going to be an important part of that. And all the fungicides reduced defoliation, and Preaxor in this case did actually the best. 2 applications, again, better than 1. All right, most important part is then the yield response to the different fungicides. So these are the only ones that had a significant response in yield. So what is that, half the trials? So half the time you can expect a significant difference by your yield. So we can control defoliation, but it doesn't mean we're always going to have a yield benefit to it. A couple of years ago in our area, they were talking about 500 pounds of lint, 600 pounds of lint. I think these end up averaging about 200 pounds of lint. So I think in all of the cases here, 4 out of the 8 locations, the Preaxor again was the best treatment out of those. The greatest yield protection in 3 of the 8 locations, so that's the Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. 2 fungicides better than 1, 2 of those locations, and then Preaxor and Headline definitely had the better yield protection over the non-treated control. You know, to me, when I'd like to present something to you, I wish I could say this would work all the time, but that variability really, you should take home that I'm going to have to make this decision on a field-by-field basis. You know, I don't think we're going to be able to make broad brushstrokes with this particular disease. Last year we didn't see much, and I don't think many fungicides went out, and that may be interesting to see their data from last year. All right. Fungicide trials in soybean. Now this is the one where we really lack a lot of data with, so I asked my colleagues around the Midsouth to provide me some data. We had hardly no target spot. I put out 2 trials. We got everything set up. I even inoculated, ran the pivot irrigation to try to get it really developing and starting to be significant. 0 target spot. And that's what's so difficult. If I go to a field that has nematodes and I put out a variety there, I can get it impacted by the nematodes, and this thing's going to have so much variability with it. All right. The first trial, this is from Mississippi. This is some of Tom's data, and this is his best data set he says he's had with this. So kind of work through this a little bit. This is his DK 4744. So if you've been in soybeans a while, you know that one is highly susceptible to frog eye leaf spot. Also gets quite a bit of defoliation from target spot as well. So his orange line across the top, that's the percentage of defoliation. So 50% defoliation for the non-treated. You move across to those 2 Preaxor applications with tilt and Thompson, and it really drops. Those little asterisks indicating there's a significant difference in that defoliation. But, you know, what is it, 10% difference at best? So there's really not much there. And then all across the board from those different fungicides. That Trevino TRZ, that's like Affiance, Froghorn, and Acropolis. I don't know if you've heard of those that have Thompson in those, thiophenic methyl, plus either tebuconazole or tetraconazole. So we have a lot of different fungicides that we can use in soybeans. Unfortunately, you know, none of them are just stopping this particular disease in its tracks. So then he has the yield response there. Even though Approach Prima did not have the most significant suppression of defoliation, it had the highest yield in this case. So it's really hard to say that the defoliation represented the yield response, right? I hope that's your point that you get from this. So it's a lot of variation. All right, this other trial, this was from Heather Kelly in Tennessee. And this was kind of one of those opportunities that was going on in the field. Probably about by R3 timing, they started seeing some defoliation. And the Asgrow 46X7, those that tell me that's similar to the 4632. So it's a really good resistance package into frog eye leaf spot. So here you can probably see the definitely impact from the fungicides and that of target spot alone. So she applied it at R4 timing. I'm assuming the canopy was already closed by then. You can see the control and defoliation there. The Preaxor definitely the best. No significant difference. So basically that's saying that the amount of defoliation didn't have anything to do with the fungicides. You can see it at 35 days after planting, asking a lot from a fungicide. Stratego yield there at 84% defoliation, Preaxor at 60, and which one, Top Guard EQ, actually had the least amount. Take a look at the yield response here. Not quite a good correlation to what we saw with defoliation, right? Stratego yield was good, and here we're low, right? Preaxor pretty close. There's a high yield benefit there, although it didn't have the greatest suppression of defoliation at 35 days. It did at 7. And there's no significant difference in the yield response. And some of that, she said, may have been due to some of the poor stands that they were looking at within this field, which may have clouded some of that response. So these trials are quite different, and you know, I wish I had something clear to say, do this, you get this response. It's going to take us a little bit longer before we get to that point. All right, so what's the risk of this particular fungus developing resistance to the fungicides? So we have what? We have Topsin as a group, we have the strobies as a group, we have the triazoles as a group, and we have the SDHIs as a group. That's all we have. We have a lot of trade names, 50-something, but those are the only chemistries we have. I can tell you that the resistance to the strobilurins for this pathogen has already been confirmed. So basically in some fields, that's not going to be effective. So then you have something like Preaxor, then you're using one mode of action to control that particular disease. The strobies are definitely a high risk. The SDHIs are a medium to high risk. So how long is it going to take if we, you know, depending on how we're going to use this to go into the future, if we say, hey, we're just going to spray every field because we're worried about target spot, it's probably not going to be long before we cannot even use Preaxor to control it. So I guess my point is definitely keep that in mind. Try to use good IPM management instead of just going out and saying, yeah, we're just going to treat it, from the response of, hey, we just want to treat it. All right, so some concluding remarks, things that I think are important to take home. Some of that gets a little wishy-washy to an extent, but target spot can be yield limiting. I think that is best documented in cotton year after year in Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. I don't think it's been as well documented here. I know some people, anecdotal, says we got hit hard by it. But I can tell you in the 2016 season, everybody said they lost 30 bushels because of the amount of defoliation, but we saw similar amount of defoliation on soybeans, and we didn't get that significant of a yield loss. So something else is going on there too. But the onset is, and the severity that will vary from year to year and location to location. So that's going to be an important factor. The onset of severity, the amount of defoliation, is going to determine the amount of yield loss. So if it starts earlier in the season, obviously you're going to expect that you're going to have more significant defoliation contributing to yield loss. Now I'm kind of stepping out on a limb. Some of the amount of defoliation from cotton is kind of based on what the folks have done with that multi-state group. But the one for soybeans is kind of personal based on some scientific data on the amount of defoliation we can expect in soybeans, as well as when you think you're going to actually be able to treat. So if you're going to have defoliation by mid-August in cotton that's going to reach 30%, I think you're probably going to benefit from a fungicide. By that time, you're already going to have the canopy closed. You're not going to be able to treat all the way down, but you're going to be protecting the upper canopy. Same thing with the soybeans. You're probably not going to penetrate down below where it's at, but you're going to keep it from moving up through the canopy. Right. Fungicide application, especially Preaxor, when applied early in those trials, by the third week of bloom, the best at controlling defoliation. It didn't stop it, but it sure slowed it down. And that may is capitalized because it may protect the yield potential. We don't see it all the time. Within the cotton, the 2 applications always does better than 1. To me, definitely have to look at the economics of that. Is that going to actually justify? Soybeans, We're definitely seeing some trends, but nothing there that is consistent. That's going to take a few more years of data before we can figure that out. Fungicide applications, when applied late, note above white flower 5, may complicate some of the late season defoliation. We saw that in Arkansas a couple years ago, where they were applying fungicides late and they had trouble getting the leaves to drop off of them. We also saw more anecdotal that we saw more boll rots where fungicides were used. There was more leaves retained in that lower canopy. So that's often the time why you see the yield differences between those being so close together. So that's not helping you much. I would say if a lot of times folks would ask me, when do I stop? And if you know 30 days before you're actually going to apply defoliant on cotton, stop. Don't treat, whenever that is. All right. That gives you a number you can feel comfortable with. I feel comfortable telling you that number. And finally, definitely practice good management with fungicides instead of being prophylactic and just trying to treat every field. I know that's a challenge, but that's the job we face. I face it with you. We're in it together. We're trying to find answers, but it's going to take some time.